Hi, everyone, and welcome to the panel on global perspectives and international opportunities. I'd like to briefly introduce the panelists here, make one or two comments, and then get going with a few questions. We will leave 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of the session. So starting off from right to left, Doug Becker, who is the CEO and founder of Laureate, among other education businesses. Antonio Carboneri, the founder and CEO of Anhanguera in Brazil. Aseem Chauhan, the chancellor of Amity University in India. Louis Hsieh, the CFO of New Oriental. And then Louise Rogers, the CEO of TSL in the UK. Before we dive into the questions, just two comments on international education and the opportunity. In emerging markets, it's fairly straightforward that in order for these economies to continue growing, massive investments need to be made in the education system, and those education systems need to keep expanding. And I think that's fairly straightforward to most of the investors, operators, and foundations here. But even in developed markets, education plays a large role in connection to the domestic market or developing market. So for example, in Australia, education has actually become the country's second largest export. Similarly, in the United Kingdom, when new visa regulations were put in for international students or proposed at the end of last year, the opposition didn't come from the immigration lobby. The opposition came from Vince Cable, the Secretary of Commerce, saying that we will lose a massive amount of profit from the system if we were to stop international students coming in and expanding the industry. So clearly, international education is playing a bigger and bigger role in the scheme of the education industry. With that introduction, I'd like to pose one question for the whole panel, and I'll have Doug start and maybe move from right to left, which is education is a relatively new industry. And in just a couple of minutes, could you describe the story by which you have ended up in the education industry? And when you started in education, what was your impression of its growth potential relative to your impression today?
Well, I think for many of the people involved in education, it may not have really started purely as a commercial venture. I think that many people are attracted by the fact that they think they can make an impact. There's a gap that they want to fill or a problem that they'd like to solve. And certainly in my own case, that's how it started. I started with an educational software company that taught people how to use word processors. Of course, now I'll have to explain to my kids what a word processor is. But then over the years, had the chance to migrate into many other aspects of education, including K through 12, and now most of my time spent on higher education. But I still think it's the same concept. Either you're looking to fill a gap, or you're looking to make a difference, or you're looking to do both. And for me, that's what's really drawn me to the field.
Antonio?
Yeah. I started the business. Anhanguera was a non-profit organization because in Brazil, before '96, it was not permitted to be a commercial or industry, just like association, foundation, a non-profit. After '96, we built a company just thinking how to bring to the young people in Brazil the opportunity to get a university degree. Because in Brazil, we have a lot of federal universities, but they only work during the day and not in the evening. And the young workers, how to study. Then we built a model, new kind of curriculums, and in the first 3 years, I suppose, I had 10,000 students. And it began '94. In 2006, we prepared to go public. In 2007, I had 30,000 students. And now, 350,000 students in 15, 16 years. I suppose the success of this organization is the practical curriculum, good teachers, trained and retrained teachers, and a good management.
Excellent. Aseem?
Yes, I was born in and raised in Germany, came to the US for my university, and ended up in private equity. But throughout, there was a sort of magnetic attraction towards education for a few reasons. One, all four of my grandparents had been in education, and from the speakers that I heard yesterday as well, many people had been associated with parents or other people in the family in education, and I think that does have an influence. Also, I had a deep conviction that, especially for countries like India and Brazil and China, which are in an earlier stage of development of the economy, that one of the very crucial pillars that has to be there in a big way has to be education. And our family had a foundation in India in a smaller way to contribute to education development. And the growth of it really came as an automatic impact of the great supply-demand mismatch between what the demand was for quality education and the supply of relatively inefficient and low-quality education being provided for the masses. There are pockets of excellence, but for the broad base, there was actually nothing. And that has fueled the great growth of Amity.
Lewis.
Thanks. I ended up in Chinese private education. I was recruited by headhunters and investment banks to help New Oriental IPO the company. At the time, I had about 10 or 11 companies chasing me at the time because of Baidu's successful IPO in China. And the only company I'd ever heard of was New Oriental, and I'd even heard of them 10 years before that. Because when I was a business school student in Boston, the students that came through there were all alumni of New Oriental. So they took all their TOEFL and GRE test preps and GMATs through New Oriental. So the only name I ever heard of. When I joined the company a little bit later, I was just surprised. I was just shocked by how enormous the business opportunity was in private education in China, because in 2003, the government had just passed the private education promotion law, giving private companies the same rights and privileges as public companies. So before that, the market was basically closed. And so that created this enormous opportunity. And you're talking to somebody who worked in tech banking here in the Silicon Valley for a number of years, so I know how big the enormous opportunity here is in Silicon Valley. And I was just floored by how big the opportunity is in China and how many different sectors there are that are really untapped. And it's been a phenomenal run for the last 6-7 years. When I joined New Oriental, we had 2,700 employees. Now we're pushing 25,000. We had 600,000 students the year I joined. We just passed, our fiscal year ended in May, we have over 2 million student enrollments. And we just tipped the iceberg. There's 200 million kids in China between 6 and 21 who are in informal education. So that's how enormous the opportunity is. And we're just very pleased to be in that market at this time in China's history.
Louise.
Actually, this is my first job in education, and I hadn't worked in education until 5 years ago. Before that, I was running a media company down the road from here, running rock and roll magazines in America, completely different, which was great fun. But I was approached to join TSL at the time. It was bought out from News International by a private equity group as a change manager, and somebody who worked in media. And I thought it was an amazing opportunity. It's a 100-year-old company, which everybody had heard of, the biggest B2B publication in the UK, but absolutely dying on its feet. No real future unless everything changed. But really worthwhile doing that. So I joined, and I thought I'd made a huge mistake. I hated it for the first 3 months. The group didn't want to be in private equity ownership. And everything seemed broken. And then I started to talk to teachers, and they were the most amazing people I'd ever met, and really inspirational and absolutely dedicated and worth doing something for, I thought. So I've been there ever since.
Yeah, and there's definitely a pattern, I think, within this group, but also broadly within international education of starting as a social cause, starting from technology or media, and now formalizing the sector. And just starting with this, a question specifically for Doug. Laureate is one of the most global higher education businesses. It's a business that has found success.
Does that mean one of the most?
The most. There
Start
you go.
over.
Platitude. And in order to drive growth, you've adapted your model to different geographies, and for a while you actually relocated to Hong Kong to push Laureate's growth in Asia. Could you talk about the potential for Asia as you see it now, a few years down the road from that move, and why has Asia been challenging for some operators and investors from the West?
Sure. Well, it's been an interesting dynamic for us, and I think for many others. Many of the international companies are international by definition because they're outside of the United States, but they're still domestic to their country. And Brazil would be a great example. Anhanguera, great leading company in its country. And what we realized was to build a scalable business on a global basis, the most scalable business, we needed a strategy that would be different from each country to the next. So we would have a different competitive set in each country, and we might be willing to provide a different range of services. In our case, those still bounded within degree granting higher education, and in our case, generally speaking, bachelor's degree and above. So that's the way we defined broadly the opportunity. A lot of our work started in the Spanish-speaking world. We expanded very broadly throughout Latin America. Even today, we have about 600,000 students, approximately $3 billion worth of revenue, and we feel like we're just starting, which is what I think is so exciting, the common thread that you hear here. To your point about Asia, though, today Asia for us is still less than 10% of our students, and part of the reason I relocated there and spent a year was I really felt that the variation between the strategies of each country was so much greater than what we found in other regions. We operate in the Middle East, we operate in Europe, we operate in the US and in Latin America, and as different as, let's say, Mexico and Brazil might be, and those differences are just vast. They are very small compared to the differences between Japan and India, or between Thailand and Australia. And so I think a lot of the reason why you haven't seen more, bigger, faster scaling up of higher education, and this may be more specific to the degree granting aspect, is how different the countries are. And that's probably the most important dimension of the difference will be in the regulatory context. Because, of course, differences to understand the needs of customers, that's one thing, but what government is prepared to let you do, and in some cases they're prepared to exclude things for good reason, to protect people from the kinds of problems that have ultimately been the case here in the US, for example. But in other cases, the regulations just don't make sense. And in many cases, even the regulators will say it doesn't make sense. But they are not always capable of changing it. So I would just sum up by saying it's the differences in the countries and amongst the countries in Asia and the wildly different regulatory regimes that are in place today.
And is it your opinion, for example, that eventually, all things proceeding as they are, that Asia would become most of your revenue at some point in the future? Or is it that you see that relative to the rest of the world, Asia is just a component?
I do believe that Asia will be absolutely the biggest region for us in the world, but it's hard for me to say that would happen in the next 5 years. It's probably 10 years from now that will happen, and it will probably be 10 very challenging and painful years to get there. And I couldn't think of a more exciting way to spend the next 10 years.
Excellent. And Antonio, when it comes to the big emerging markets, the BRIC economies, Brazil was really the leader in deregulating, the leader in recognizing the role of private capital and private organizations. And Anhanguera has built this immense scale and an immense brand. Recently, you've made a successful entry into distance education. Where do you see the next leg of growth for your business? Is it within Brazil, within the businesses you're in?
First of all, we are now in 8 states. There's a lot of Brazil to go. We are in 8 states and 61 cities. I suppose you are in the beginning, because our model is a scalable model. In all these 61 cities, the business administration program has the same curriculum. The law program, the same curriculum, and so on. Then I have a textbook program with all of this. When the student enroll in the campus, he receives a pack of books. I'm selling today about 1 million books per semester to the students. And the price is about 20% of the cover price. I suppose we're in the beginning because mainly evening programs we have. And I suppose we can double our capacity in 2 or 3 years at most. Then I should like to think about Latin America first, not Asia. Don't go there first. But I think Latin America will receive it well, because I suppose the curriculum that Anhanguera developed is for a generation. It's not for rich or for poor. It's the new generation that's coming. This is what the curriculum was made for. I suppose the success of this curriculum is this kind of a vision we have.
Now, you've mentioned the scalability of Anhanguera, and within a country as a private operator, it is practically unique in terms of campus-based education. What have you done so differently that has allowed you to reach this scale relative to your competitors in Brazil? And what perhaps are the lessons for some of the other operators in higher education that are earlier in the curve, for example, in India?
Listen, first of all, I think that university must go where the students are. We are not a downtown university. We are a neighborhood college, first of all. Second, the price. It's affordable price. Third, quality. I put in third, but it's not the last one. Because the student perceive the quality after one semester of school, not in advertisement, you know. Then I suppose these three pillars are fundamentals to developing the future of Anhanguera Group.
Excellent.
Localization, price, and quality.
Excellent. And now, Asim, you know, it's interesting, Brazil is quite well, I shouldn't say well explored, but it is known to investors and operators, Laureate or DeVry or Apollo. China is certainly better known than India in that there are many publicly listed Chinese companies in the West, and there are successful foreign investments in the Chinese education sector and higher education sector. The elephant in the room, so to speak, is India.
Yes,
And how does an international or a Western or even another Asian operator successfully engage with India? Because the last few years we've seen, you know, a lot of pain for very little gain.
Good question, Karan. What I'll do is I'll break it up in three different parts, only because I think in the audience we have operators, and operators we have seen, these I've met, you know, on the sort of traditional non-profit private side, also for-profit institutions and universities also. But then there are also a lot of companies here which are technology companies that are doing enabling technologies, either in content or other things. And thirdly, there might also be investors here. So and the perspective to India is different from all three of them. So very briefly, for the universities or institutions here who want to operate in India, I think there's a very compelling reason. I don't think we need to belabor the reasons why 56% of the population below the age of 30, gross enrollment ratio of higher education at around 15%. By any measure, the National Knowledge Commission projects that 1,000 more universities are required in India, 15 to 20,000 more schools are required in India. So we are, at the moment, opening up decades of pent-up demand. So for universities and institutions, clearly there is a great market that can be tapped. There are a lot of different ways to do it, and the big challenge clearly in India is the regulatory framework. We are a highly regulated country in terms of education, in which universities and schools have to be operated through non-profit foundations or societies. But at the same time, we see a lot of activity of universities active in India, and it happens in a few different ways. Several universities are looking to establish full-fledged campuses in India, and there's on the table of the parliament something called the Foreign Universities Bill, which will at some point hopefully pass, which will allow foreign universities to come and establish full-fledged campuses, and the Carnegie Mellons, the Dukes, and others are looking actively to establish campuses. Number two, if a university does not want to make that kind of investment in India, there are a lot of other kinds of agreements, articulation agreements in which a student is part-time in India, part-time at a foreign university that is getting very popular, and bringing Indian students to universities around the world and lowering the average price point that the student would have to pay. And the third area is research, in which there's a lot of collaborative research happening. For example, MIT, out of Cambridge, Massachusetts, is setting up a research center at our university in New Delhi to focus on very specific emerging technologies with the idea of spinning out joint IPR and commercializing those patents. With the University of California in Davis, we're running a Bill and Melinda Gates funded project in India across 14 states, asking the question, what can we do for the most marginalized farmers in India? So that kind of intellectual and expertise exchange, that is, sort of third component of the university and institution grouping. For the enabling companies like education technology companies, content companies, I think immense potential. Because if you think about what are the challenges of growing the capacity in any country so quickly in such a short period of time, ERM companies, CRM companies, ERP companies, LMS companies, DBM companies, adaptive learning companies, gaming protocol companies, online platform companies, there's a whole host of technology solutions that I think Indian universities, as they grow and look for quality and efficiency, will need to lean upon. And I think that is definitely some of the things that I've seen over the past day and a half, which I get excited about, some of the things that are happening right here in Silicon Valley, which I feel could have a lot of implications in emerging markets around the world. The only caveat to that is that the solutions that I think will do well in a country like India are those that have a proven track record in other countries before they come to India, just so that that initial gestation period of comfort is quickly is crossed. Thirdly, in terms of the investors, India has been a challenging environment for private equity investors. In 2010, we had $260 million invested in about 25 deals. In the first 4 months of 2011, we have had $130 million across 11 deals. The reason why the deals are small is because of the regulatory environment, and the investments are generally across areas that are unregulated. So tutoring businesses, test prep businesses, preschool businesses. And I think as the regulation changes, those investments could potentially get bigger, and the private equity firms that are looking at India now will be in good position to take advantage of that.
Thank you for that. And there's a second question for Aseem in that you know, I know that Doug will probably have looked at this, and it'd be good to get Doug's comments on this, but Africa. You know, Africa is, as a continent, should have similar growth characteristics as India. It should have a similar issue of deficient quality from the public sector, with room for the private sector to enter. And Amity has done so.
Yes.
Is there any way you could comment on your reflections on the potential of Africa, on what has helped your business succeed there to date? And it would be good to get Doug's reflections on how Laureate has considered Africa.
Absolutely. No, we are very bullish on Africa in the longer term. It's early days in Africa at the moment, but I think an early mover into Africa for the next 10, 20 years would have a great advantage. And there is, of course, the great, I would say, desperate need for quality education in Africa. The way we have approached it at the moment is through VSAT technology, in which we are broadcasting lectures from India into about 53 African countries and ramping up very quickly. It began as a Government of India grant and aid project, in which we were one of the few universities who were selected to provide content for the project. But more and more, we are now taking over the project as a standalone university and offering programs in a variety of different areas to students in the 53 countries. What's exciting about Africa is that they're very keen, and they're very open to invite anyone who can provide quality education into the countries. It's also a very risky area. You know, the political shifts that keep happening, the instability of some of the countries. I think one has to be careful when one goes in, especially to make larger investments. But if one can find models and ways to operate in that comfort level zone, I think there's great potential. We have established one university in Mauritius, and we are now looking to establish universities across 7 more countries in Africa over the next few years. But having provided the online education and VSAT technology education in Africa gave us brand recognition and comfort and connections in the countries so that we could roll out in a more meaningful bricks and mortar way as well.
Also, having a business in Mauritius helps you get to the beach.
Yes, as someone had pointed out earlier. So,
Doug, your reflections on.
I think Africa is a little bit like Asia in that the regions are so distinct. So a strategy for North Africa would be completely different from a strategy for another region, or going by language. For example, Professor, I think you should go to Angola before you come to the rest of Latin America, where we're waiting for you. But just kidding. But I think that, so that's what makes it exciting, but very difficult. The strategy for how you would approach French-speaking Africa would be completely different from the Lusophone countries, for example. But the opportunity is there. I would say the barriers are immense, because the price points would be low, and while the governments are very welcoming, there's a lot of dysfunction, a lot of corruption, and for the kind of, and of course there's corruption everywhere, and the job of responsible managers is to build businesses and build cultures of institutions that don't tolerate that. But it's very difficult in countries where it's endemic, and where you would end up having to go to the various highest levels in the government to find the kind of support you would need to be able to successfully operate to the international and ethical standard that everyone would expect of you. But on the other hand, the social impact that you could make in a place like Africa, to me, it would be a dream come true. And we've thought about things like even pursuing Africa as a nonprofit initiative, of contributing our intellectual property and experience, or teaming with foundations, or working with the World Bank, which we've discussed, or other ideas. I'm just not entirely sure how much of a commercial enterprise it is and how much of a social mission it is. And while both are immensely important to me, one thing I learned a long time ago is to be very clear on which is which. So we're still a little bit unclear on that.
Another theme that has been mentioned is the role of technology in scaling up education businesses, certainly in distance education in Brazil and in the campus business that you're running, Antonio. Is there any way to, for Antonio, Luis, and Louise to maybe comment on the role of how you have used technology to both grow your businesses and create and maintain quality within the business? And it'd be good to hear a bit from Luis and Louise, and we could have Antonio then comment on it also.
Sure. I mean, for us, China, like India, Brazil, and other emerging markets, is too big a market. And so we need, because of the distances that need to be traveled, we use technology in many ways. Our CoolLearn site has 6.5 million users, so we can distribute content and offer classes to students who otherwise don't have access to our programs because we don't have locations in the cities yet. I mean, you think about China, we're in 44 cities, probably the largest 44, but there's 200 cities in China with a population greater than 1 million people. So they're bigger than San Francisco or San Jose. We're only in 44 of them, so we can't reach the other students. So many of the students who want to take our test prep or subject classes can come in and do it online. So that's one way. Second way is how do you train teachers across the country so that you have comparable quality to the ones you have in Beijing and Shanghai or some of the larger markets? Well, it's very difficult to be flying thousands of teachers every year to Beijing and Shanghai to get trained. So we've used the technology to help us with teacher training. We spent a lot of money setting up video conferencing systems in every one of our cities and centers so that teachers can be trained remotely. Another way is our student registration center. One of the ways to save costs is that we have everything, students now register online. You don't need to wait in line at registration. When you have over 2 million students a year, the lines can be quite long. So now 1/3 of our students in Beijing and Shanghai actually just register online. So technology is helping us really scale the business that we otherwise would not be able to do cost effectively. It saves us a lot of money. The other thing we've done is we've implemented a whole new CRM system. So we're able to track students across the country now. So when they move from Beijing to Guangzhou or to the hinterlands of China, our CRM system tracks them. We know exactly what their history is. We can hand them off to the next city to where their family has moved to. So we're trying to use technology in many ways to really streamline our business, to give better access to our students. And now we're moving to this, as everyone sure in the audience knows, with ebooks. Right? Many students we're beginning to offer books online, so that you don't have to have paper. Just you can get whatever books you want. We're not known for selling books, but we sell 14 million books a year. We're one of China's largest 5 booksellers. To be perfectly honest, it's a really terrible business in China because of IP issues, but it's supplemental to our core business. So technology is absolutely critical to our success in scaling our business.
And Luis, as you reflect on technology within TSL, is there any way you could comment for the audience and describe a little bit about how you use user-generated content and how you seek to, some ideas around monetizing that or what you're going to do with that in the future?
So we set up a platform 3 years ago, which is essentially just a place where teachers can upload their user-generated teacher lessons and plans and materials. And it is, at its simplest, an electronic filing cabinet. And teachers can upload and download materials free of charge, and it's all UGC. And we thought, well, they might be interested in doing that. Well, it took off completely. We watched it, and it grew and grew. So it now has 78,000 resources in it. 60,000, just over 60,000 are user-generated. We also go out and make partnerships with anyone who has resource for the classroom. And the usership on that is huge. So it's the biggest social network of teachers now. It has about 3 million unique visits a month, about 50 million page impressions, and they're downloading at a rate of well over 5 million a month. So that's over, that's a resource being downloaded every 2 seconds. every time they download a resource, rather than build it, they save about 30, 40 minutes. And so you can see that it's having a massive, massive impact. But I think more importantly for us, it's really, we believe it's raising the standard of education. So, you know, if we all built a lesson plan and one of us built the best one and we all taught that lesson plan, education just went up. And teachers love sharing resources. It's all peer-reviewed. It is a Google model, so the best rises to the top. And it means that you can celebrate teachers for what they're actually giving back to the profession. So, you know, we have a teacher, my favourite teacher is Bev Evans, and Bev is a primary school teacher in Wales. And she's uploaded about 270 resources, and she's been downloaded 1.4 million times. So Bev isn't sitting in front of 30 kids in Wales. She's actually educating across 170 countries with her resource. And that's what technology has done.
She's like a rap star on iTunes.
Well, part of our job is to make those people celebrities and celebrate teaching and raise that standard and put the spotlight on them. And because we're a media company, we can do that. I want Bev to go to the Houses of Parliament and be given a car by David Cameron because she deserves it. And I also want the textbook publishers to start thinking, what on earth is going on? Because this is content that is outstripping some of the best commercial content.
Antonio, could you?
In our distance learning, in Brazil it's a little bit different. It's not totally online because it's mandatory to do that. Then we have distance learning centers, about 300 in the country, 300 cities plugged to satellite technological ways. And the distance learning have the same textbook of the campus discipline, the same one. And we have 2 nights per week, each program, with the teacher in the university here. And the class is in real time with the 300 distance learning center. Same books, same teachers, the full teachers. And locally, we have a tutor with this kind of student at the same level, but satellite technology. Why satellite? In Brazil, there is something different. It's I suppose a culture. In web technology, the dropout is about 50%. In satellite technology, about 14%. It's a question of social groups, I suppose, participation, and it's a cultural problem. But it's working well.
Excellent. And Lewis, just thinking about New Oriental, switching themes a little bit, almost back to the questions that we've asked Doug and Aseem about entering an emerging market. You know, New Oriental has been very careful about which lines of business to go in. New Oriental has the brand, the reputation, and the capability to try its hand at almost anything. Could you comment a little bit about how New Oriental has selected lines of business to operate in China, and you know, what are the sort of criteria and how that's worked out?
That's a very good question. Thanks, Karam. I think for New Oriental, we have an 18-year history. So the company was started in 1993. We really focused originally on TOEFL and GRE test prep. That's all we did. And of course, that entails a lot of English. So 14 years ago, we started teaching adults English, just general English instruction. So we became a company that had a couple core competencies. We were very well known in language training and test prep. Those are our 2 core competencies. So we basically began to build businesses around those 2 areas of our core. We haven't tried to stray too far from what we're good at. And the second thing we try to avoid is exactly the government. So in China, the government regulates K-12 education, the content, the degrees. The government regulates colleges and the degree granting process and how many bachelor's degrees each school can grant and accreditation. So we stay away from those. We basically focus on the areas that are sort of tangent to that, like after-school tutoring in all subjects, which is direct, because you know, for us, English language was our core competency. That's the #1 subject that Chinese students need to learn. It's 25% of their Gaokao, which is the equivalent of the Chinese SAT exam. So imagine what would happen in America if Mandarin Chinese was 25% of the SAT. So that's exactly the comparable in China. So we focused on that, and we said, well, if we're good at GRE with math and English, why can't we teach physics and chemistry and biology and Chinese history and politics. It's exactly to the same students. It's just a different subject, but same teaching methodology. And so that's what we've done, is we've never strayed far from our competency of language training and test prep. And that's why I think we've been quite successful. The other thing we've done is that we've been extremely patient. We don't rush anything. So many of our foreign competitors who come in are in a hurry to make money. They have a 3 or 4 year exit. Well, you know, when we expanded outside of Beijing in 2000, we lost money in Shanghai and Guangzhou for 3 years, but we stayed the course. We were able to accept losses for many years in order to build a long-term business. Because, as mentioned earlier by some of the other esteemed people here, is that every province in China has their own language. Every province in China, every city in China has their own local regulations and their own local content differences. So the SAT or the ACT here in the US is standard across the country. In China, the Gaokao is standard, but there's local differences. Well, you have to be in the local markets to know those differences. So we spent a lot of time with local, entering local markets, and we do it very slowly. We only enter 2 or 3 cities a year. We only add 60 or 70 centers a year. So we have 500 learning centers today after 18 years. In the same 44 cities, by the time we're finished, we'll have over 1,500. Just in the same cities we're in now. Not to mention the other 150 cities we haven't touched yet. So it's patience, it's local knowledge, and it's sticking to what you're good at. And to be honest, without getting too much, it's sort of avoiding government regulation. Because the government will basically regulate the profit out of that area.
Excellent. Yeah. So being cognizant of getting everybody to lunch on time, perhaps we could switch to Q&A from the audience. So there'll be some mics passed around. No hands up for anyone who is...
While you're waiting, can I make a quick comment?
Please.
Just the comment that Louis was just saying about regulation. I think one thing I'd really want to emphasize for people looking at the international markets is just because there's a market doesn't mean that you're going to be able to operate in that market. And regulation, it's not the government always will seek to regulate the profit out, but they will regulate. You used the expression earlier, deregulation in Brazil. But as the professor, I'm sure, would agree, it's not deregulated at all. It's actually very smartly regulated, very actively regulated. And I just want to, I'm often cautioned when I think about, for example, in the US, the student loan market, which was a private market that existed at the pleasure of the regulators. And people just assumed that would always be the case. And then one day, the mindset, the shift, or perhaps the perception of value add changed, and that industry was gone. And I think it's something that, for people operating in the various countries we're talking about, we never can take for granted the fact that we're able to operate we operate at the pleasure of government. Government is the partner at the table, whether you acknowledge it or not. And so in our company, when we have a meeting, there's always an empty chair that reminds us that government is sitting right there. They're our partner. And if we're doing our job right, they actually will seek us as a source of advice. And if we're doing our job wrong, they will see us as the tall nail that needs to be pounded down. And we devote ourselves to being trustworthy to government and partners to government. And I think you'd find the successful operators either have that approach and characteristic, or they're not long for this world.
That's a great point.
Can I make a comment on that? Because TSL was interesting because it was always felt that the government would move against TSL and put up a portal for teacher recruitment, which would be the end of that company. And in fact, we believed that unless we could do the job properly and fill those roles properly, that's where the main income comes from, that would happen to us. But actually regulation did come in and it made us much faster and it made us innovate much better than we would have before. And I think it completely transformed what we did. I don't think without that it would be as strong. And I also think that we now talk to the government all the time. We are completely speaking to the department and to the cabinet office and say, well, what do you need us to do as a private company? How do we need to produce results for you in order to be able to operate in this area? So I don't see it as a totally bad thing. And, at the end of the day, there's also regulation that says children are supposed to go to school and we all make, money out of that. So it's not a totally bad piece at all.
I mean, it seems regulation is a pretty important theme. I actually have a question for the panel. And this is, probably, again, the market, amongst all the markets here that are represented on this panel, the most overly regulated market and badly regulated market, without a question, is India. And I guess my question to Aseem is, how do you engage with a government that, questionably does not even have the best of intentions on the table? How do you deal with a government like that?
Yeah, well, I would disagree a little bit on that, because I think the intentions are there, and you know who the players are, and the ministers and the senior level people do want to head in the right direction. Everyone wants a positive outcome. But being a democracy, being a coalition government, I think it's sometimes difficult to push through what exactly you want at the right time. I think India is moving in the right direction, and I also agree with Doug on the point that better regulation is sometimes better than no regulation. And we always say that we need to think of new frameworks to look at education and how it's monitored, as opposed to no regulation, which would possibly cause more chaos than do good. And we do work with the government very closely. I think it is a dialogue. And at the moment, the two statutory bodies in India, the University Grants Commission and the All India Council for Technical Education, we are debating and discussing with the government that those should be abolished, and a new framework in India should come up, which is the National Council for Higher Education and Research. And we as a private player have very much been a part of that dialogue to create new ideas about how it is done. And we bring in ideas from our experience, what's happening on the ground. So I think partnership with government, especially if you're in these areas which are regulated, is very crucial. Just one thing I would like to add also, I think what's also exciting in India at the moment is that there are successful models being seen which have been developed on a low-cost basis. So when we go into Africa, where the price points are very low, we can bring the learning and the modes and mechanisms and technologies to the table that operate very effectively in a very cost-effective way. As I've been hearing some of the things happening in the US, and India has always been learning from the US. I mean, the US is still the model higher education system for any country in the world. We look at the universities here and learn from it. But I think there are some things happening in emerging markets that can be transplanted into other parts of the world because of the low cost efficiency that is coming out.
In Brazil, the regulation deals mainly with quality standards, not economic standards. In fact, we are deregulated in economic stats. Now, you could put your money, could get your money, well, no trouble. But in quality standards, we are very regulated. That's where the government put his hand. That's an empty chair, he said. It's about quality.
Excellent.
I have a question here.
Latin America doesn't speak one language, nor does Asia, nor does Africa. So when you're trying to be in all of these different markets, how does that affect content and delivery?
Well, I'm mainly in Brazil, just Portuguese. But if I thought to go Latin America, the other side is Spanish. It's easier too. I mean, of course, it's difficult to be
for
there.
Doug, I think Doug is the guy that needs to answer this.
The teachers are all Brazilians.
But Laureate operates across so many geographies.
28 countries. I think we started with one. It's a great question, because for us, we started with one language. And we actually spent a long time, this is 12 years ago, debating what should that language be. And the English, which was logical for us, we realized that the English-speaking countries were generally the better served countries. So then we thought of other languages, and Spanish made a lot of sense. We started in Spain. We went to the next two Spanish-speaking investment-grade countries at the time, Mexico and Chile, and then we went everywhere. But it allowed us to start with transferable management, best practices, curriculum. Having one language was very helpful. Most companies, their approach would be start with English. And I think actually, unless they're teaching English, like what Louis does so well in China, I think actually you wouldn't get anywhere near the kind of traction that you could get if you're prepared to adapt to the language requirements and cultural requirements and regulatory requirements in each country, or even each province within a country or state within a country.
Does TSL plan to modify its offering to, for example, have a Mandarin site or a Spanish language site?
We'll be doing two things this year. So, no, we'll be looking at India as a market, and we'll be looking to modify the language for that. But mainly we're looking at where take-up is already high. So, for instance, I think that I was having a look at the other day and you suddenly realise you've got 9% of all Australian teachers. Well, that's really odd. So maybe you go off and do something in Australia, but I think we'll be driven by those people who are already engaging with this.
Hi, my name is Bhargav Sri Prakash, and I'm here with Friends Learn. But this is a topic that's really close to me. Myself was an international student to the US for graduate school many years ago. And actually, Friends Learn is making the official social 3D game on Facebook to market America as the destination for higher ed to the world and recruiting international students. But given all your perspectives, I want to know that as we see it, the trend is it is a global marketplace for education, and America is looking to be the destination to the world in terms of being a source of education. So how do these countries, making that assumption that that is a strategy that's going to win out in the long term, how do these different countries that you operate in think of attracting international students and internationalizing education to deliver higher quality education in these regions?
I take that, Karan. Well, I mean, speaking from New Oriental's perspective in China, we do two things. One, it's very important to us is that our fastest growing business is actually younger Chinese students who want to study in the United States. So if you take away, side point, if you look at the balance of trade payments between the US and China, China spends about $18 billion a year sending students abroad. 289,000 students left China last year to study abroad. So second to Boeing aircraft, that's the two areas that the U.S. gets a balance of trade credit with China, is education. So the U.S. is definitely the first destination. We have over 40,000 students who are coming to the U.S. directly for college, and over 100,000 internationally. So it goes, the U.S. is first choice for most Chinese students, UK is second, and then probably Australia, Canada, and other countries thereafter. So that's one side and Chinese students are coming not just for graduate students in school anymore, but for undergraduate and for high school. So one of our fastest growing tests now is the SSAT and TOEFL Junior. So that age group is moving down from graduate students to undergraduate and now to high school directly and prep schools across the world. So the international exchange is great. The other point I'll make is that last year was the first year ever in China that more students from from other countries came to China to study than Chinese actually left to study abroad. Over 300,000 students from around the world came into China to study. Many from the US, many from Africa, from other Asian countries. So actually it tilted for the first time ever that there's more students from abroad studying inside China than Chinese students leaving to study abroad. So I think this exchange of not just culture, but of education systems and of global perspectives is very important. And it goes both ways.
How does Laureate handle this transnational student flow?
I think it's really interesting, and it's sort of democratizing in a way, in that it used to be that everyone, generally, that you were going to the US or to the UK, then increasingly Australia, Canada would come up. But we're seeing such interesting things. There are over 100,000 foreign students studying in Japan because people realize that Japanese, if you want a career in Asia and you want to differentiate yourself, speaking Japanese, you don't have to then work in Japan, but you can work for a Japanese company or a Korean company. There are 100,000 international students studying in Malaysia. Now, these are big numbers. I think the number of foreign students studying in the United States is in the range of maybe 500,000 or 600,000, something like that. The idea that 100,000 foreign students are in a country like Malaysia or Japan, I lived for the last 3 years in France. They have, I think, maybe 200,000 or 300,000 foreign students, a lot of them subsidized, and a lot of them from French-speaking countries. And the French government is willing, and I guess until they have bigger budgetary pressure, they're willing to accept large numbers of students, and they see it as an important part of building culture, building commercial ties. Germany has done the same thing, just massive subsidies to allow foreign students to come, and they're going to need it because that's where they're going to get the workforce based on the declining and aging population. So the dynamic, some countries do it for pride. There's a big push for Turkey, for example, which has become such a force in its region to want international students purely as a function of stature. But until very recently, if you couldn't pass their Gaokao, their Turkish test, you couldn't study in Turkey. Well, not a lot of foreign people were prepared to speak Turkish and pass the Turkish exam. They changed that now. So I think you're seeing this happening for workforce reasons, for trade and culture reasons, for stature and political and geopolitical reasons. To me, I think it's one of the most, I'm not sure what the commercial play is, or even if there is one, I think there's probably 10 commercial plays, and maybe 9 of them are bad. But in terms of the geopolitical and cultural aspects, I think it's just fascinating.
Well, I mean, just to comment on the commercial opportunity, Singapore, for example, their Global Schoolhouse program has attracted over 100,000 students to Singapore. Now, that's a country with 4 million people, of which over 1 million are expatriates, and they now have 100,000 international students in there.
They need to grow their population.
And it's a massive foreign exchange generator for their economy. Amity has an institute in Singapore, and you know, one theme that Parthanon has been talking about is Malaysia and Singapore as a way of playing India and China, because they are more friendly regulatory environments, more suitable infrastructure.
Yes.
And you know, Asim, what's been your experience in Singapore on that?
And absolutely, I think more broadly than Singapore, I would like to say that the idea of global education is very important now. And that's why, although we are predominantly a group in India, we have developed campuses in London and Singapore and Mauritius and now in Dubai and other parts in the world, because there's an interest for students to be in other parts of the world while they're studying. And last year alone, we sent 5,000 students from India to our other campuses who just wanted to go for a short period of time. Some of them can't afford to go to a foreign university for longer periods of time, but to get that experience while they travel around, and Singapore has been a very popular destination. And when they do that, they also interact with the local students we have at those campuses. So I think that merging and sort of exchange of ideas is very important, and at our group, it's part of our core philosophy that the globalization of education and how do we make offerings for students, that is crucial. We have a program in which a student does a third of their MBA in India, a third in London, a third in New York, and that's in collaboration with NYU. So I think these kind of programs will be very popular. Also, to your question about students going to study abroad from, let's say, India, as opposed to foreign students coming to India, I think we are seeing an inflection point at the moment where more and more foreign students are coming to India. And why do they come? I think employment opportunities, and better universities, better opportunities in terms of global education, standards, hygiene in the hostels, many different things which were not there a few years ago. I think there is sort of a coming together of multiple factors which may increase the number of international students coming to India as well.
I'd like to be able to address sort of one or two other questions and themes. So if there's another question from the audience, we could take that on. Did you have one earlier? No. We can stay on the theme then. Okay. There we go. Oh.
Hi, Bobby Kirshan. I'd like to ask the woman from TSL, in terms of all of these resources and teachers, how are you leveraging? It's free, so what's the monetary value of it, and how do you see that feeding into changing teacher education in terms of teachers? I think the largest growing for-profit opportunity worldwide may be in teacher education and educational growth. As we're educating more and more people, the schools that are the for-profit schools are having problem finding educators. So you've got these teachers building this curriculum for free, and how does that impact teacher education?
So I think on the monetization issue, we'll start experimenting with that this year. I think that the UGC, we won't charge for the UGC. I think when we do look at resources that have been particularly popular, there is an opportunity to repackage that and share revenue with the people who produced it. I think that's an interesting model for us. We're also interested in the home market. So we think that in the UK, the tutoring market is worth somewhere between £1 and £1.5 billion. And that means getting a teacher into your house at the right time to sit down and talk about maths. Well, that's not a very efficient market. We bought a small company called Bright Spark, which does essentially what Tutor Vista does with a slightly different ethos, but where you're looking at online tutors with real resources, but importantly a tutor there to talk to students one-to-one, and we think that there's real opportunity there. I've seen that at work, and I've seen it work incredibly well. It's incredibly powerful to see kids interacting with tutors online, particularly when you start thinking about children who maybe are completely disengaged at school, are really not respecting their teacher, are dropping out. Actually giving them an online relationship, education relationship is a really interesting area, I think. In terms of CPD, if you like, I think it is shocking in the UK, I'm not sure about the US, that you can qualify as a teacher and you really don't have to do much else for years and years and years to continue teaching. Architects have to do continual professional development as part of their qualification, but teachers don't. I think that should be fixed. And I think that there's a real opportunity for teachers to start sharing information about best practice. That's what they want. And I think there is an opportunity around that. We are seeing people sharing information, not just about lesson planning, but about what they want to do in order to become better teachers themselves. There is a huge drive within the profession to improve what they do all the time. And I think there's an opportunity there, it's true.
We have time for one more question before we break for lunch. I think Justin over there.
A question, I'd like to hear your perspective on. There's a lot of companies here who are investors in this space or want to be investors in international markets, and a lot of strategics here, education companies who are in the US or Europe who haven't gone into your market. So what are the opportunities for them? Should they be looking at an organic business in partnership with local entrepreneurs trying to build it, or should they be looking at an acquisition strategy? If we look at your markets specifically, from your experience, should it be organic, or should it be looking at, are there acquisition opportunities in these markets?
That's a great one. I think it's almost good to start with Doug. I mean, you'll say acquisition, but then roll over to...
There are no opportunities in any of these countries. I would recommend the Caribbean. And then when you're finished, call me and we'll tell you where to go next.
No, let's, that answer, I want to say. Inside the Anguera Group, I have a corporative university. I have a teacher's college inside the Anguera. Because we evaluate the teachers and advisors twice a year. And if he's not well this semester or the other, it must be retrained on Saturday morning during all the year. Just like an MBA. All the Saturday morning we have classes for teachers. And we have an MBA, a proper MBA, to train coordinators to be directors. I'm training about 40 directors per year. Well, you can realize now why I need 40 new directors per year. There's a lot of opportunity. Expanding campus is a reality for us. But we are training 40 future directors per year. And a teacher's college, just about in function of that evaluation, we train, retrain, and so on. Because it's very different in a country, just like Brazil. It's not a country, it's a continent. In town, they graduate in several parts of the country. There is no unique teacher's college. We must retrain all of them.
And coming to this theme about if someone was to enter Brazil, and this is a very broad question, it's different for schools, different for higher ed, but is it about acquisition or greenfield? Partnering with someone local?
The greenfields, it takes about 2 years to begin. Bureaucracy and so on. Some years it's easier, some years no. Then acquisition is better. We are developing half and half. But in Brazil, we have about 2,700 colleges. I suppose 30% are commercial ones. The other ones are non-profit, foundations, and so there's no much opportunity to buy.
Yeah. So I think to answer your question, it really depends what area you want to play in. India is still very early days to be able to offer a lot of opportunities that are acquisition ready. From all the private equity investments made, there's only been really one real exit, which was Sequoia and Lightspeed Ventures selling their stake in Tutor Vista to Pearson, and maybe 2 more coming up over the next few months. So as such, the targets are very few. Also, because of the great interest in education in India and a lot of capital already being on the ground, we have seen that there have been very high valuation expectations. So there's already been a bit of an overheating in the market, despite the fact that not many deals are happening. So I think that when one goes to look for acquisition opportunities, I think that can be a barrier also. In terms of establishing greenfield, it really depends what you want to do. If you want to operate in the unregulated areas, the tutoring, the test prep, the preschools, that is actually easier to get off the ground. You can start with less capital. There's not really any barrier to entry. If you're interested in establishing a university or a school, then as per the local regulation, it requires that you buy land. And land acquisition in India is also getting prohibited because of the costs at the moment. You need to do construction. So some groups are not comfortable with that level of involvement on the ground. So maybe it depends what domain particularly you're interested in.
It would be good to sort of conclude the panel with remarks from Louis on China in this theme.
Well, I think China's been a hotbed for foreign investment in education. I think since New Oriental IPO'd 5 years ago, there's been over $1 billion in private equity money that's flowed in the education sector. And you saw a flood of Chinese education IPOs at the end of last year. So you've seen that money begin to exit already. So similar to what Asim has said, though, it depends on what area you want to play in. So I think for higher education, it's a very long road. So I think as acquisition is probably a more preferred route because you have to get accreditation from the Ministry of Education. You have to build this big piece of land, build dorms, recruit students. It takes years and years. So unless you have a longer than 10-year horizon, I would think that higher education is a very difficult post-secondary to be starting a college from scratch. I think where we play in after-school tutoring and test preparation and language training, we have 30,000 competitors. It's pretty easy to start a new business. I mean, we have thousands of competitors. The issue is to get scaled. The biggest challenge is that Chinese consumers are name brand buyers. So it takes years to build a brand. And so so you can start a school, but you can't really get big without building a brand. And it takes a lot of time. So I think if your horizon is less than 5 years, I think acquisition has to be your preferred route in almost anywhere. If your horizon is longer than 5 years and you can be very, very patient, then I would think greenfield is a good opportunity in many areas outside of outside of post-secondary degree granting area. In China.
Excellent. So I think that was the time we had allocated for the panel. I'd like to thank our panelists for their excellent contributions today. Thank you.